John, do you want to start us off with some questions?
Sure. So I would encourage you to go ahead and get up towards the microphones if you'd like to ask questions or make comments. I would encourage you to ask questions. So since we've got one, go ahead.
Oh, you want me to go ahead first?
Yeah, I'll do mine if I need any time to fill in.
Raj Sharma from HealthWiz. We are a mobile application platform to do virtual and hybrid clinical trials. And so to us, this looks like a big problem that needs to be solved. 58 million vacancies that can't be filled for clinical trials. A lot of clinical trials fail because the participants don't follow through and fall off during the middle of the trial. So as an entrepreneur, it looks like this is not the case where a solution looking for a problem, but this is a huge problem that needs to be solved, which is great and exciting. And having said that, I don't have leave alone clinical trial background, I don't even have a health background. I have a telecom background. So what excites me is things like FHIR and SMART and standards and what ONC is doing. Now there are some members on our team who come from a video game design background. And to them, this looks like a video game design problem, right? So we have essentially built this platform that looks like a video game to participants. So there are badges, there are prizes, there are leaderboards, there are tokens that people can earn by participating, clearing some milestones, clearing whatever hurdles are there in the clinical trial. Again, the whole thing is how do we engage participants over a long period of time. So it's not a 2-hour video game, but it could be 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years.
So can I ask you, do you have a question for the panel?
Yeah. So the question that I have is, has this been tried in the clinical trial industry, number one? Number two is this too extreme and far out that people are not even going to look at it? And if it is not too far and too extreme, what is the right audience to present this to? Is it pharma? Is it CROs? Is it patient advocacy groups? So that's thoughts on that.
So I think you don't want the approach of, here's my tool, my game, how can you use it in a clinical trial? But instead, it starts with, what is the clinical trial? What are the endpoints that they need? What kind of outcomes are they trying to achieve? And then what kind of tool can you build? Or in what ways can the tool that you have fit with the data collection, the types of data that they need to collect, as opposed to here's my tool, go use it. I think that's what you were saying. It just sounded a little bit like, we've created this really cool game and can somebody use it? Gaming might be a very effective way to actually get people very interested in participating, and not just from the outset, but to keep them interested and continuing to input the data, because the game gets it out of them in a way that's fun as opposed to tedious. So I definitely can see some possibilities. In terms of policy, I don't know that there's anything that's sort of different. I mean, depending on how the tool is used, is it going to be HIPAA covered or not? We don't know. You'll need, if you're actually having your tool used in a clinical trial context, you'll have to have a consent, potentially a consent engine built into it in some way. I'm not sure. I think there's promise, but it's the tool for the trial versus the trial for the tool. I'm not saying this right, but I think you get my point, which is it fit for purpose, right? And it might be it's fit for one trial, but not for others.
Andrea?
Hey, so earlier this summer I was at DEF CON, which is a security conference, and one of the things that they were talking about was how do we do these new types of social contracts? So if I'm going to go online and you're going to surveil all of my information or data, do I just sign up one time through this informed consent or not of the end user license agreement that none of us actually read? So I was wondering what implementations have you seen of companies who have done this well? Like just doing it one time, or I'm sure everyone's figuring it out right now, but I think the All of Us program has been doing a really thoughtful approach for doing patient-centered either consent or legal agreements, and was curious of other examples that you've seen.
I feel like this is a John Wilbanks question because he's done a lot of work on this. The All of Us program is the one that I was going to provide as an example because that's the one that I'm the most familiar with. They just a huge amount of work went into designing the consent for that program in order for it to be understandable and not just a check the box encounter. I can say just quickly before I turn it over to John, he has so much more information on this than I do, but from a legally, where GDPR and the California Protection Act are trying to go is a more informed experience for the user, for the person whose consent is being sought. It is a super hard thing to do, particularly in a mobile context. And a lot of times really informed means more information, and then people are overwhelmed, and that's when you get the scan through and the click and folks doing it. So it's a very hard thing to do, but.
So I'll be brief because this panel's not about us and what we do. But I'll try to connect it maybe back to the theme of the panel that I've extracted, which is that sort of when you have technology and sort of desires and real problems, right, connected, they try to run faster than policy is built, especially regulatory and legislative policy. And I think Devin has done beautiful work on using guidance when she was at OCR to try to keep up with the pace of technology. FDA is using some of the same mechanisms to keep up, right, and go faster. But it's, and the nice thing is seeing in GDPR, it's buried in Article 12.7, they call for iconographic and visual consent methodologies as an example of an informing tool, right? So, but it's not just us. RTI, right, is here today. RTI has done some beautiful work around user-centered design for consent. Patients like me and 23andMe were there before any of us in many ways in doing aggressively designed consent experiences. So I think that this is not new. I think what's happening is that things look impossible when they're going through exponential growth curves until the moment that they pass over the line and become obvious. And I think we're getting to that moment of it becoming obvious that giving people a 20-page document in 8-point font on a phone isn't consent, right? It's legally consent because you signed the document, but it's not informed consent. And so I think the world is just coming a little closer to where we are in health already. And if anyone wants to talk about this, I'll be around at the break, but I don't want to take over the panel. Do we have other questions from the audience? Sure. John over there first, and then the gentleman over in the middle. It's John, right?
Yes.
Yes. That's it.
My name is John Birch. I'm with the Mid-America Angel Investment Group in Kansas City. I'm an outsider and an observer in this space. I have to do this has been an excellent panel. I've learned a lot from you, Leonard, and I learned a lot from you, Matthew. My questions are for Devin and Leanne. Very specifically, Leanne, could you tell us a little bit about the registry study that the city did? I believe it was completed a year or so ago, but I've seen market forecasts calling for the growth in the use of healthcare research registries in healthcare to go from somewhere about 400 million. There are vendors who sell registry software, and the market's going from somewhere around $300 or $400 million to over $2 billion in the next couple of years. So it's there's something happening there. I was wondering if you could tell us what you know about it. My next question is for Devin. If the government, if Congress and others are considering changes in HIPAA, what is under consideration? Could you please give us a kind of a summary of that and your opinions of those things?
So Citi did a project, and the recommendations were released last year on really how to do clinical trials that were embedded in registries. And we came up with recommendations to address two different points. If you have an existing registry, what do you need to consider to make sure that your data can meet regulatory requirements for clinical trials, for a regulatory submission trial, for example. And also, we are noting that a lot of new registries are being built. And so there are also specific recommendations on if you're going to create a registry, here's what we encourage you to think about on the front end so it can be used for research and specifically clinical trials purposes. So that's really the nature of our recommendations. It's interesting because real world evidence and real world data is used a lot now, and this whole notion of how you think about existing data and repurposing it for clinical trials. And it turned out timing-wise that after our registry recommendations were released, the notion of real-world data started being used more, and everybody's like, "Oh, registry is one of those too." So I'm not sure if that's true or not, but our recommendations were in the context of leveraging registries for clinical trials.
Just a quick comment on that. The FDA is funding a lot of registry development for rare diseases, I know, to help study longitudinal natural history. I think that's the goal. And so a lot of that is clearly for research and regulatory purposes.
It's true. I will have to say I've also heard people be critical of registries, saying that in essence you are creating a siloed source and putting a lot of resources into starting from scratch and creating a siloed source. So we didn't specifically take a position on that issue, but if you have one or if you're going to build one, we would encourage you to think about use broader than maybe the initial use.
In terms of the legislation that's being considered, it is not HIPAA reform legislation per se. It is really a response to the California law, to be quite honest, and potentially GDPR to get some greater equivalency in the US to what's going on globally. The way that most people regulate privacy in the world is through data protection laws, which means that they apply if you have the data. And it's a similar set of rules across the board. So you don't have these gaps in protections where, like we do in the US, where we do sectoral regulation, where if you're HIPAA covered, you're in HIPAA. And if you're not HIPAA covered, well, maybe you have FTC obligations. But if you're a nonprofit and you're not HIPAA covered, you don't have either. And if you're doing research, but you're not subject to the common rule, and you're not actually doing medical product development, then you're not potentially subject to the common rule either. And then you fall just completely out of regulation altogether. So what Congress is considering is being more like the rest of the world and saying we need to regulate like all personal data, of which health would be one piece of that. And so then the debate comes up, well, do you regulate globally or do you still allow states to have more stringent laws? And then the other issue that comes up is, well, what do you do about the entities that are covered by HIPAA and are already covered by Gramm-Leach-Bliley? Do we just get rid of all of those and say, here's the one law? Or do we carve out exemptions? If you're HIPAA covered, you do HIPAA. If you're Gramm-Leach-Bliley, you do GLB. But if you're not covered by any of those, then you do this new law. This will take a long time to figure out. Right. This may never get figured out. That's where my money is, but I'll let you guys decide.
One of the big pains in the butt that Craig will remember we found in remote that I'm facing now is about prescribing drugs, study drugs, and the need to make that comply with state laws. And it sort of didn't make much sense to me why getting the approval from the FDA was sufficient. And the logic here was, once you've got a protocol very well defined, drugs dispensed under GCP, according to a protocol, often involving or usually involving a blinded placebo, it doesn't make any sense that that falls under a state prescribing, because no doctor in a state taking care of a patient can prescribe a placebo or drug in a randomized fashion according to the protocol. And so I kept wondering, why isn't it that, or couldn't it be, that the FDA's approval for dispensing drug, even across state line, would not be the standard, what it would be what's necessary in order to conduct these trials across state line. The alternative of going state by state, as some of you know, is really expensive and time-consuming and a barrier to doing trials that are free of geographic limits. And so an answer to this that says, yes, FDA is sufficient, would be terrific. Can you just say yes, Leonard?
Yes.
I wish I could give
Cross-examination
you any
was
answer.
leading the witness, as David said.
So why not? What stands in the way of saying we're following a protocol approved by the FDA, and doctors locally in states can't prescribe a placebo or a blinded drug? It makes no sense.
Yeah, I have to defer. That's really not in my area at all. It's legal and...
Damn, that's the question.
I hate to disappoint you. I mean, I certainly agree with you in sentiment, but I'm not the expert on the legal basis for the state laws. So I don't know, Leanne, do you have any thoughts?
I was going to...
They've looked at
No,
this issue.
but the states, I don't see why the states have, or doctors who are giving drugs for indications.
But perhaps we can expand this out a little bit. And so I think one of the concepts is that the state-by-state variation, right, represents an enormous amount of complexity, right? So we've encountered this simply in the consenting and the HIPAA authorization form design process, right? Leanne mentioned it in the concept of direct patient shipment telemedicine. So, you know, Leanne and Leonard, do you want to sort of talk a little bit just about state complexity? I mean, it's pretty easy to get into sort of larger concepts about the framing of this country's government pretty quickly.
It is. Actually, we have somebody on our team who's from Europe, and she just was like, I don't understand why the U.S. requires separate practice of medicine in every state. Europe doesn't do that. I can go practice anywhere. And it does raise the bigger kind of U.S. Framework. So I don't really understand the nuances of why that specific situation
Who can
exists.
fix it? I mean, does it have to be fixed state by state, or does it have to
Congress
be
can
fixed?
fix it.
Yeah.
I mean, essentially, as long as Congress is authorized to act, which they have, because they passed the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and all the regulations that flow under that, as long as Congress is in a constitutionally appropriate space for federal action, they always have the power to come in and create a law and say in that law, this preempts state law. And then in that case, all the state laws go away. Otherwise, they don't.
This is excellent. So to bring us back to the clinical trial context and to the city work looking at participant expectations and perceptions, we really probed the privacy protection data question, and most people said they weren't as concerned about sharing their data in the context of a clinical trial. We also talked in the last session about trust in clinical research. The collection of passive data with consent that's maybe not informed, and then add in a commercial element to it, that doesn't sit really well with patients in surveys. So how do we reinforce trust in the clinical research enterprise if we're going to use health data that wasn't generated in a clinical setting?
At 23andMe, I think our approach, which is, it hasn't been a complete approach yet, but we offer very disaggregated consent. So people can consent separately to our use of passive data, which currently just HealthKit from Apple, from their general consent, which covers our use of their genetic data and health survey data. And then we have other separate consents that would allow us to share their data with other parties. So we have a bunch of different separate consents that allow people to opt in or out of different uses of their data, if the uses are the primary concern.
But does it specifically state that it will be sold?
Well, so the limits are on the uses of the data, right? So only I guess what could be the selling would be if somebody signed an individual consent, and that would allow us to share data with a researcher, something like that, with a research partnership, or a pharma company. So that would be the context in which it would be maybe sold as data, right? If that's what you're talking about. But we do analyses on the data for research purposes, and that's covered under the general consent. So it's a different consent where there would be no transfer of any information about a person. So we try, but it's not clear that breaking it up like that actually makes it easier for people to understand. So we need to figure out how to make it easy for people to understand which uses you're asking them for, and allow them to consent to that use or not, but without having it be overwhelming, obviously.
So can I follow up on this a little bit, and I'm going to ask Devin maybe to think a little as well. So under the California Privacy Act, would a scientific hypothesis derived from the research that Matthew was talking about count as an inference?
Yeah, I do. I think so. I mean, we're still trying to unpack that law, and the legislators are continuing to kind of amend it and tweak it in different ways in order to respond to people's concerns because it was passed very, very quickly. But yes, I think that it would. Now,
it's not a very tight piece of legislation.
It's not tight. It's messy. It was enacted again very quickly in response to trying to keep an initiative off of the ballot. So they rushed a lot of things through. But one thing, again, if it was in the context of a clinical trial that was subject to one of the exceptions, it wouldn't matter the inference. There's part of the personal data definition in the California law gets very broad because it includes inferences, not just the actual data. So it includes that as data. So, and also creates complications around de-identification around inference data too. So, but again, if you're pursuing a clinical trial, the exceptions are like get out of jail free cards, right? If you can hit one, then you can basically shove that law in all its complexity to the side and say, I don't have to worry about this. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, it's just the reality. And again, something Congress will have to consider as it sort of thinks about both covering the gaps and all of the issues that are on its plate. I want to piggyback, if it's okay, on the question that you just asked outside of the context of what 23andMe is doing and think more broadly about concerns about using commercial tools in a study where you're encouraging people or requiring people to use a particular tool. And the data that you're collecting from the participant in the study is, oh, we need your weight, or we need your observations of daily living, or we need a whole collection of stuff, and we need you to be providing that to us regularly. But in the meantime, the person's using a tool that may be, so when you say passive data collection, this is what comes to mind. It may be collecting geolocation data. It's not being fed to the researcher, but it is being fed into the app or the device. Collecting, let's say there's a voice activation aspect to it in order to make it easier. Well, suddenly it's collecting casual conversation in the home in addition to when the participant speaks into the tool in order to report the outcomes they're being asked to report by voice. I think it creates another dimension to the consent to say, you're using your home tool, you're using this app, you need to also consider, here are the privacy policy in terms of use of that particular application as we're encouraging or requiring you to use it as sort of part of the informed consent for the trial. Because even though it's not data that you're collecting as part of the trial, it is data that's being collected from the individual. It's just not being used in the trial. So your informed consent for the trial arguably doesn't have to cover that data that isn't being collected by you, but it is being collected in a tool or a device that you're being asked or suggested, encouraged, required to use just separately. And it creates an ethical dimension to the consent process that I think is a bit can be dealt with appropriately, but is something that you need to consider. And then what do you do when you're sort of asking people to use a tool where you actually don't really like their privacy policy or terms of use very much?
Yeah, I was grateful that Matthew brought this up, and I would just make one more comment on sort of for-profit versus nonprofit, which is that companies can do good and nonprofits can do evil. And so it's easy to regulate based on the tax status of the entity, but I think it's more important to focus on what's the proposed use, who has control, who has access, and how is it governed? Because it's very easy to launder things through universities if you're a large company in order to take advantage of the university's tax status. But then almost all of the inferences are then transferred back to the for-profit entity. So it's, I think that's why I think your point about it's the questions that you ask and the analyses that you do that really I think we need to be having the conversation about.
So, John, if you don't mind, I just wanted to follow up on Devin's comment, if that's okay.
I'm sorry, I didn't see.
That's okay. Actually, the point I wanted to make was one of the things that we are imposing on ourselves, and I would encourage anyone who's also thinking about using these sorts of things, is establishing a trusted data partnership so that you actually do understand what their policies are, and if you don't agree with them, you don't use them. And then you're in a better position of really being able to assess whether or not, and so is the participants, better able to assess that you have taken the time to explore the trusted data partner in such a way that you now are putting that forth as a tool you think is worth using, not only because it's going to be the utility of it, but the trustworthiness of it. So I would encourage all of us to take that on ourselves to figure out. So.
I have a question. I'll target it to Devin, but obviously anyone who wants to should weigh in. And it may be a little bit ill-posed because I'm still thinking about it. But as Devin knows, and as many of you in the room probably know, there's a growing movement called a variety of names. One of the names is consumer-directed exchange, and it takes advantage of the emergence of required APIs in HIPAA-regulated entities' software. Let's just take EHRs as the prime example, which makes it quite easy relative to the old days of a consumer pulling down a copy of their record onto a device that they control or proxying it to a third party to whom they give rights to use that data. And it's going to be a focus of ONC to increase the scope of these APIs over the coming years, and the vendors will be implementing the ability to get more and more of your health record with a push of a button or a click of a EULA to download the record. So one of the thoughts that some people have proposed for this is that by taking the data out of the covered entity regulated under HIPAA and putting it in the control of the consumer, where it's regulated essentially by contract law that's governed by whatever it was you clicked through when you authorized a third party to use your data, you may simplify and improve the ability to have that data get used for useful purposes to your benefit and bypass some of the complexities and pitfalls of the regulations that we've been hearing about. So sorry for the long-winded explanation, but just to put the context of what consumer-directed exchange is about. Devin, do you think this will change the landscape of the conversations we're having here in a meaningful way? Should it? Could it? You may riff in whatever direction you wish.
Well, so I mean, you certainly could see in the context of a virtual/innovative/decentralized clinical trial where part of the data that you need in order to conduct the trial is medical record data, and rather than sourcing that from the doctor, there may be circumstances under which that could be sourced directly from the patient because the patient is collecting that regularly through some sort of FHIR endpoint or however. And yeah, I mean, it is the case that the patient-facing entities don't have the HIPAA compliance hurdles that might have served as obstacles, and you may have a greater opportunity to be able to reach people directly and know that you're dealing with an audience of individuals who is very eager to participate, who are activated. They have their data and they want to contribute, and you're giving them an opportunity to do so. I think the challenges of making sure that people are really truly informed about how they're sharing data, really touch on a lot of issues that have been brought up by some other commenters in this session and in other parts of this conference, which is, so much online is click the box and move on, right? How do we, and what efforts can we make to make sure that when people are truly informed about the choices that they're making in terms of sharing their data, and then what role can we play? I thought Sally's point was spot on. What role do we play in our various stakeholder roles, including entities that will run patient gathering platforms, which is what Citizen does, to make sure that we're not asking people to just throwing all of the obligation for protecting data on them, which is essentially what informed consent really does. Are you okay with this? Well, then that's fine. Let's go. Can we do a better job of sort of vetting what choices people have, or at least recommending those, or providing a rating score that will help people make the choice that's right for them? For some people, I'll wallpaper my data on the outside of my house if I think it's going to save my life, and I don't really care Others have a greater degree of sensitivity, and you need to give people the kinds of choices that matter. But there is a role, I think, to play. Don't put this all on the consumer in the consent, no matter how good it is. What do we do about sort of making sure that the choices that we're serving to people are good ones?
Well, and that maybe feeds into a question I'd like to ask Leonard and Matthew to respond to, which is, Leonard, you raised this concept that as we move towards more different technologies for decentralization, that some of the buffers we have for inspection, right, might start to break. And when Matthew raised the concept of you might be delegating some of your inspection to the technology, right? So what happens when there's a failure to oversee based on an internet outage? Right? What are the kinds of buffers that we can expect to break, and what are the kinds of new buffers that we might need to develop? And I'm sorry to put you on the spot.
Well, I think one of my thoughts is that really we can't delegate to automation. The responsibilities that a clinician has are basically to react to situations, to react to adverse events, to stop a drug when it's causing toxicity. And automation can do that to a point, but you need at least the reassurance that somebody has sort of human intelligence, at least at this stage, at this stage of science. So, I think it's very important to think about when things will malfunction, what are you going to do? I'd mentioned the importance of making sure that when the technology is not going to work, you have some backup. If for argument's sake a glucometer is reading 40 when it should be reading 90, you should have some sort of controls in place to make sure that that's not the sole thing you're relying on. So it's I think part of the question is what is the criticality of the data for which the automated system is being used, and what sort of backup systems do you have there to make sure it's used responsibly? I mean, one shouldn't put all your eggs in one basket. One internet connection is probably not enough.
And Matthew, it's sort of the same question, but more maybe from a benchmarks and algorithmic transparency perspective. If you've got algorithms filtering some of this passive data to the responsible investigator, what are the sorts of buffers that we can have there?
I guess if we wanted to put some kind of manual checks back into the system, right? We could ensure that there would be a more thorough analysis of the data rather than relying on the algorithm periodically, right? Perhaps as often as would happen in a face-to-face trial. I'm not a computer scientist, but computer scientists are pretty good at figuring out, and this may get back to the game comment, right? Figuring out ways to test software so that when it fails, people are properly notified. And in my experience, it can happen very quickly, and they can be quite good at it. So I don't think we should underestimate the potential for software to do some of these activities very well, perhaps better than actual humans can do them, which is what software is good at in some cases. Certainly, if the adverse event is something that a person can report, as Leonard said, it may be possible that remote reporting can actually be much more effective than in-person reporting, but we still have to deal with these technical challenges, right? Like internet outages, whether someone is actually available to provide the information, et cetera, which is where the third part of what I was saying, the paradata comes in. So you need all this additional information about what's going on in the person's environment to know whether that person is capable of giving you the information that you need.
So I think we have time for a very quick question.
Really quick. I get updates, software updates on my phone.
Can I ask you to speak into the mic for the webcast, please? I know.
This last week I got a couple
it.
of notices about software updates on my phone. I'm sure nobody else got such things, right? Why can't, if you're involved with an electronic conformed consent, why can't you get the same kind of notification when something changes? And it has to be an electronic consent linked to all your specimens and such, which is done now. It's trivial. But I mean, it's pretty simple to get an update on my phone if that's the way I provided my consent.
I think that's a good idea, and it's really just a question of what's burdensome for participants and what will work. We have to worry about the scientific concerns of the trial too, and asking people to do things repeatedly can itself cause attrition. Right. So we have to know, like, what's the proper cadence for doing these things, right?
So if I have sort of one takeaway is that the interconnectedness of the policy environment with the implementation tools, whether they're legal or technical or scientific, makes this really complicated. And it's an area that actually rewards paying attention to the details. And that's often not how consumer tech likes to treat policy. And so I've complained about the fact that regulations can kind of shield the space from innovation, but I think it's also shielded us from some of the more radioactive data business models that are sitting outside and driving the regs that Devin talked about. So can we thank the panel, please?